Larry, a janitor in an office building, was used to the silence of the early hours of the morning. Working night shifts was nothing new to him. In fact, he even liked the peace that the nights provided. No people walking around, no phones ringing, just him and the echo of his own footsteps. During working hours, the building was in constant chaos, but at night, everything seemed frozen in time. He began his routine as usual, turning on the lights at reception, organizing his cleaning materials, and going through each floor with precision. Each task was almost automatic, but that night brought a different feeling. Maybe it was the accumulated fatigue, or just his mind wandering, but Larry felt the air heavier, the kind of feeling that makes your skin crawl for no apparent reason. As he cleaned the windows in the lobby, he remembered the rumors he had heard from some of his colleagues, stories that the building, so modern on the outside, held ancient secrets in its foundations. They said that one floor had been closed for many years, and that nobody talked much about why. Larry never paid any attention to these stories. To him, they were just urban legends, created to scare the most impressionable. As the evening progressed, he went about his routine, but something broke the usual tranquility. Suddenly, he heard a low, almost imperceptible sound. It sounded like laughter. He paused for a moment, trying to understand where it was coming from, but the silence soon took over again. He shook his head, laughed at himself, and went back to work. "I am hearing things," he thought, attributing the sound to his week's fatigue. As he moved through the corridors, the sounds returned, now a little clearer. It was as if distant voices were echoing in the corners, mixed with low laughter, as if someone was having a good time far away. Larry felt uncomfortable, but refused to believe that anything was out of the ordinary. After all, he passed that building every night, and nothing strange had happened before. "It's just my mind playing tricks on me," he muttered to himself. But with every step he took, the feeling that he was being watched grew, making that night strangely different from the others. Larry advanced through the long, empty corridors, carrying his cleaning trolley with the same discipline as always. The sound of the wheels squeaking on the waxed floor echoed through the silent building, mingling with the faint hum of the fluorescent lights. However, that uncomfortable feeling that had started earlier persisted. The thought that his mind was just playing tricks on him was no longer so comforting. As he cleaned the second-floor windows, the sounds returned, this time more intense. Childish laughter, light and soft, reverberated through the empty corridors. Larry stopped again, trying to locate the source. It was getting harder and harder to ignore. The laughter didn't seem very far away, but there was no one there. The floor was completely empty as usual. He frowned and looked around, hoping to see any employees who might have stayed late. But the silence abruptly returned, as if there had never been any sound. Larry rubbed his eyes, trying to shake off the fatigue. "It must be the tiredness," he said to himself. Maybe he was just too tired, hearing things that weren't there. It wasn't the first time he'd worked late, and it certainly wouldn't be the last. Still, there was something in the air that night that bothered him. He tried to concentrate on his work, but with each passing minute, the sounds seemed to return, sometimes muffled, sometimes clearer. The laughter was accompanied by indecipherable whispers, as if several voices were talking to each other. He began to feel his heart racing, and sweat broke out on his forehead. Larry turned slowly towards the corridor that led to the third floor, an area he avoided whenever possible. That floor had been disused for years, closed for renovations that never began. The rumors about that abandoned floor had always made him uncomfortable, but until now he had never had any reason to believe them. Now, however, the sound seemed to be coming from that direction. It was as if laughter and whispers were moving through the walls and corridors, converging on the third floor. He knew there was no one there, or at least there shouldn't be. Larry took a deep breath, trying to dispel the fear that was beginning to creep into his mind. But it was no use. With every passing minute, the feeling that something was wrong only grew. He found himself fighting the temptation to go there, to investigate, to see what was going on. Deep down, Larry knew that something wasn't right that night. The sounds he was hearing shouldn't have been there. Larry took a deep breath, gathering his courage as he looked up at the stairs leading to the third floor. Something inside him told him not to go, to continue his routine and forget about the sounds coming from there. But curiosity, mixed with a sense of responsibility, pushed him forward. He didn't want to believe the rumors, but if he didn't check it out, he'd never be able to get the idea out of his head. With hesitant steps, he began to climb the stairs. Each step creaked slightly under his feet, amplifying the silence around him. The whole building seemed to hold its breath, as if waiting for what would happen next. When he finally reached the top of the stairs, he came across the third-floor corridor, dark and abandoned, just as he had expected. The doors of the old office rooms were closed, covered in a layer of dust. The paint on the walls was peeling, and the floor showed signs of abandonment. Larry held the flashlight, lighting it with a trembling hand as he walked slowly down the corridor. Everything seemed normal, but the feeling of being watched grew with every step. Then he heard it again. A laugh, clear and high-pitched, like a child playing. The sound came from a room ahead at the end of the corridor. Larry stopped, his heart pounding in his chest, and felt a chill run up his spine. It was impossible. No one had worked on that floor for years. He took a step back, but something kept him from running away. He wanted to believe that it was just the echo of something old, a sound that reverberated through the walls, but he knew better. Cautiously, he approached the ajar door where the sound seemed to be coming from. From inside, a dim light flickered, something that shouldn't be there. Larry took a deep breath and pushed the door open slowly. What he saw left him motionless. In the center of the room, a small wooden table was covered in old toys, all dusty and weathered. Porcelain dolls, toy cars, all arranged as if someone had just played there. However, what really terrified him was a small wooden rocking horse standing in the middle of the room. It rocked gently, as if an invisible child was using it. Larry swallowed, unable to move a muscle. His instincts told him to run, but his feet seemed stuck to the floor. The lantern flickered in his hand as the horse continued to rock, harder and harder. The laughter echoed again, now coming from all sides, as if several children were laughing around him. Trying to regain control, Larry took a step back, feeling his body respond to the growing dread. But before he could leave, something else happened. The door, which he had pushed open, slammed shut with a deafening bang, locking him inside the room. Now, trapped there with children's laughter echoing and the rocking horse moving endlessly, Larry finally realized that whatever was on that abandoned floor was not just a figment of his imagination. The sound of the door closing echoed in Larry's ears like a gunshot. Panic gripped his body, and he threw himself against the door, trying desperately to open it. The handle turned in vain, locked in some inexplicable way. "It can't be," he muttered between gasping breaths, his sweaty hands slipping over the cold metal of the handle. He was trapped. Behind him, the rocking horse continued to move, creaking ominously in the silence of the room. The children's laughter, once light and distant, now seemed closer, almost beside him. Larry's mind struggled to find a logical explanation for what was happening, but nothing made sense. He knew there was no one there, at least no one he could see. With the flashlight still shaking in his hand, Larry slowly turned to face the room again. The toys on the table seemed to be watching him, as if they had a life of their own. He felt sweat dripping down his forehead, and an overwhelming feeling that he was being watched enveloped him completely. With every second that passed, the atmosphere seemed more oppressive, as if something was getting closer. Trying to stay calm, he began to look around, searching for another way out. It was then that his eyes landed on something he hadn't noticed before. An old framed photo hanging on the wall, covered in dust and dirt. He walked over to the picture, wiping it with the back of his hand. The picture showed a group of children, probably from a school or nursery, smiling at the camera. They were standing in front of a room that looked exactly like the one he was in now. Larry frowned, a vague memory popping into his mind. He had heard something about an old playground for children, a place where children used to stay while their parents worked. But what he didn't know was that the floor had been shut down completely after a terrible accident that took the lives of several children. He stepped back, his heart racing as he put the pieces of the story together. Could it be that the laughter he was hearing was from those children? Children who had never left that place? The idea seemed absurd, but every fiber in his body screamed that there was something very wrong there. Suddenly, the lights in the building flickered on and off. The only source of illumination now was the flashlight in his hands, which cast distorted shadows on the walls of the room. Larry felt the floor vibrate slightly, as if something was moving beneath his feet. He looked at the rocking horse, which was now completely still. It was then that he heard it. Light, but unmistakable footsteps echoing down the corridor. They weren't a child's this time. They were heavier, slower footsteps, as if someone was walking towards him. The feeling of being watched grew even stronger, and Larry knew he was no longer alone on that floor. Caught between the unknown and the dread growing inside him, Larry came face to face with a truth he never wanted to believe. The disused floor was not empty, and something or someone was coming to find him. Larry was paralyzed. The footsteps in the corridor echoed slowly, approaching with disturbing regularity, as if the darkness itself were walking towards the room where he was trapped. The flashlight in his hand flickered violently, the light swinging from side to side, casting macabre shadows on the dust-covered walls. He knew something was coming, something that shouldn't be there. Instinctively, Larry retreated to the corner of the room, his eyes fixed on the door. The silence was cut only by footsteps that, no matter how hard he tried to ignore them, seemed to carry an invisible weight. His heart was pounding so hard that he feared the sound would echo through the room, announcing his presence to whatever was on the other side. The footsteps stopped abruptly, as if the visitor was standing at the entrance to the room. Larry held his breath, his whole body tense, waiting for the inevitable. Then the door handle began to turn slowly. A low click echoed in the room, and the door, which had previously been inexplicably locked, began to open. The darkness of the corridor invaded the room, and for a brief moment, everything was silent. Larry stared at the door, hoping to see some figure emerge from the darkness, but no one entered. Instead, the air in the room seemed to become heavier, as if the presence he feared so much was there, invisible, watching him. And then, as if moved by an invisible force, one of the toys on the table moved. A ball, old and worn, rolled slowly across the floor, stopping right at Larry's feet. He felt a chill run up his spine, dread growing inside him like a tide about to swallow him whole. "You shouldn't be here." A soft, low voice echoed in the room, coming from all corners at once. It wasn't a child's voice, like the laughter you'd heard before. It was deeper, charged with an ancient and disturbing presence. Larry cringed, his wide eyes desperately searching for the source of the voice, but there was no one there. The flashlight flickered, threatening to go out. Larry knew he had to get out of there, but his body seemed rooted to the ground. That's when he saw it. In the corner of the room, amidst the shadows cast by the wavering light, a figure began to form. It wasn't solid, but a hazy, indistinct silhouette that seemed to be caught between the real world and something much darker. "Go away!" the voice repeated, louder now, echoing through the room. The figure moved, as if trying to get closer to him, but something stopped it, as if it were trapped in that place. Larry's terror turned into total panic. He didn't know what that entity was, but he knew it shouldn't be there. It shouldn't have entered that floor. The toys on the table began to move, as if an invisible force was manipulating them. The rocking horse began to move frantically again, creaking as if it were screaming for something. Larry, his nerves on edge, felt panic take over. He had to get out. In a last desperate effort, he threw himself towards the door, pushing it as hard as he could. To his surprise, the door gave way easily this time. He stumbled out into the corridor, the cold night air hitting his face like an instant relief. But before he ran, he turned to take one last look at the room. The misty figure was still there, watching him, trapped in its own torment, surrounded by the toys that should never have been touched. Larry knew that whatever was on that floor had been buried there a long time ago, and that he, by going upstairs, had unearthed something that should have remained forgotten. He didn't wait any longer. He turned and ran, the sound of his own footsteps echoing in the building as terror continued to pursue him. Larry ran down the stairs, almost tripping over his own feet, the sound of his footsteps echoing like thunder through the empty corridors. His heart was beating so fast that he felt as if it was about to explode in his chest. Every shadow around him seemed to lengthen and twist, as if the building itself was trying to envelop him, to hold him there forever. He ran to the main lobby, where the glass doors leading out of the building were waiting for him. Larry almost laughed with relief at the sight of the doors, a promise of freedom so close at hand. His fingers trembled as he pulled the bunch of keys from his pocket and with trembling hands tried to unlock the exit. But the keys suddenly made no sense. None of them seemed to fit. He tried one, then another, until all the keys had been tested to no avail. "No, no, no," he muttered to himself, panic returning in full force. Something was wrong, something deeper than anything he could explain. Behind him, the sound of slow, heavy footsteps began again. This time, there was no longer any doubt. It was coming towards him. Larry turned slowly, dread coursing through his body like electricity. At the end of the corridor, a shadow darker than the night itself formed, moving towards him. There was no face, just an indistinct, dense shape, as if the darkness was coming to life. Sweat dripped down Larry's forehead as he tried to process the reality crumbling around him. He didn't know what that thing was, but he felt that if it reached him, there would be no turning back. The whispering voice, which had once warned him to leave, now seemed to be accompanied by a wailing sound, like a deep, constant moan that reverberated off the walls. Desperate, Larry ran to the security room, where he knew there was a phone. Maybe he could call someone, anyone who could help him. He entered the room and closed the door behind him, locking it with trembling hands. The phone was there, on the table, but when he picked it up, there was no signal. It was as if all communication with the outside world had been cut off. The silence in the security room was oppressive, and the only light came from the flashlight he was still holding. Larry looked at the monitors of the security cameras, hoping to find some explanation, some sign that what he was experiencing was real. The screens were all static, except for one. The camera that focused on the third floor clearly showed the corridor disabled, but now there was something different. On that screen he saw the room he had been in moments before, the chairs, the toys, and in the center the nebulous figure that had chased him. She was motionless, as if waiting for something. Larry approached the monitors, breathing heavily, trying to understand. It was then that he noticed something even stranger. In the corner of the room, near the wall, there was something he hadn't noticed before, a locked door, one that seemed to lead somewhere even deeper in the building. What was there? He didn't know, but the feeling that it was connected to what was happening now was impossible to ignore. The moaning in the corridor got louder, and Larry knew that time was running out. He would have to make a decision: keep running, or face the mystery that was buried in that room. Whatever it was, he knew that shadowy figure was guarding something. Something that should never have been found. The sound of wailing echoing through the corridors grew louder, as if something was tearing the air with pain and despair. Larry, still in the security room, felt the terror growing inside him with every passing second. The decision to flee or face what the building hid weighed heavily on him, but one thing was clear: continuing to run would not save him. Not this time. Taking a deep breath, he took one last look at the monitors. The misty figure was still there, on the third floor, motionless, as if waiting for him to return. And next to it, the locked door. Larry knew that that door held the key to what was happening. The building, the voices, the laughter, everything seemed to revolve around that forgotten, abandoned place. Something was buried there, and he needed to find out what it was. Flashlight firmly in hand, he unlocked the door to the security room and prepared to return to the third floor. The corridors were filled with a darkness that seemed denser than before, as if the building itself were alive, breathing around him. Larry's footsteps echoed, but the wailing that had previously haunted him had ceased. The silence was now absolute, heavy, and oppressive. When he finally reached the third floor, the corridor was plunged into shadows. The toy room was just ahead. Larry hesitated for a moment, but knew that turning back was not an option. With careful steps, he entered the room once more. The rocking horse was standing still, the toys still arranged as he had left them, but the misty figure was no longer there. The room seemed strangely empty, but the locked door he had seen through the monitors was now in front of him, as real as he was. Larry felt a shiver run down his spine. That door hadn't been there before, at least not for him. Trembling, he tried to open the door, but as he expected, it was locked. Looking around, his eyes fell on a small key ring hanging on the wall, something he hadn't noticed before. It was an old key, covered in dust and with rusty metal. He picked it up with trembling hands and slid it into the lock. With a dry click, the door opened. What he found on the other side was not what he had expected. It was no longer a room, but an underground corridor, like a hidden chamber in the bowels of the building. The feeling of oppression in there was suffocating, the air dense, almost unbreathable. Larry descended the stone stairs with careful steps, the sound of his racing heart pounding in his ears. At the bottom of the chamber, he found what looked like an ancient altar, covered in strange markings, symbols he didn't recognize. On top of the altar, there were old toys, similar to the ones in the playroom. Larry knew there was something deeply wrong in that place. The voices, the laughter, the wailing, everything pointed that way. That's when he saw it. A diary, old and worn, lay on the altar. With trembling hands, he opened it and read the first few pages. The words were jumbled, but they told the story of a tragic accident that had happened there years before. A fire, children trapped on the playground floor, staff who tried to save them, but couldn't. But what left him in shock was the last note, which talked about the sacrifice. The toys and the altar were not objects of innocence. They were relics of something much darker, something that had been done to those walls in a desperate effort to quieten the voices. Larry felt his blood run cold. He was involved in something that shouldn't have been discovered. The building wasn't just haunted by children's voices and laughter. It was cursed by something much older and more terrible. Suddenly, the air around him began to tremble, and the misty figure appeared before him once again, sharper, more real. It was as if she was trying to prevent him from discovering the truth. "Go away," the voice whispered, this time full of despair. "You shouldn't have seen that." Larry knew he couldn't stay there any longer. Those forces were warning him. If he stayed, he'd never get out. He ran back down the corridor, hurrying up the stairs and locking the door behind him. He didn't look back. He just ran, feeling the weight of the building on him, as if every wall was pushing him to get out.